Within the first section of John's Gospel, in what some have called the Book of Signs, from 119 through 1250, Jewish festivals figure rather prominently. The next slide will show some of the festivals of Judaism, not all of them, and those festivals that may have a significance for interpreting John's Gospel. Here we have the festivals of Passover, or Pesach, of the Feast of Weeks, or Pentecost as it's called, Shavuot, the Feast of Tabernacles, or sometimes it's called of Booths, it's Sukkoth, and then we have Hanukkah, the Feast of Lights. Now over in the final column of this table are references to John's Gospel. And the only one that we're not sure of is the Feast of Pentecost, or Weeks. We'll go through this with respect to these passages in John's Gospel and see the significance of the festival for what is said about Jesus in his revelation. Also on this table are about the times of the year that we can understand these festivals to take place, and the Old Testament background passages for them. So beginning with the Feast of Pentecost. Pentecost occurred 50 days after the Feast of Passover. And the Feast of Passover isn't a fixed day in terms of the calendar, but it happens round about April, as you know, because of its connection with Easter. So Pentecost then can come in May or possibly June. Pentecost was a harvest festival. It was an early harvest festival, and it would be also associated in Judaism with the giving of the law to Moses. A number of the festivals in the Old Testament have an ancient background in terms of the seasons of planting and harvesting and so on. But then they came to take on new meaning in the Old Testament as they were applied to the revelation of God to the people of Israel. And what we see in the Gospel of John is a reinterpretation yet again of those festivals with respect to Jesus. Now, in John 5, verse 1, we have an unnamed feast, and it is a feast that also takes place around Jesus healing somebody on the Sabbath day, verse 9 of chapter 5. So the question is John chapter 5 to be read with the festival in the background or simply with the Sabbath day in the background? Now, the Sabbath day is the day of going to synagogue and hearing the law of Moses read. The festival of Pentecost is associated with the giving of the law of Moses. So either way, whether it's Pentecost or Sabbath in view, we have a focus in the background on Jesus and the law. And so we see Jesus apparently breaking the Sabbath according to some interpretations of the Sabbath because he has done some work on the Sabbath. This is something we find also in the Synoptic Gospels, for example in Matthew chapter 12. Now in John 5:45 through 47, Jesus turns the argument around. Whereas the Jews are using the law of Moses as they interpret it to attack him because he's healed on the Sabbath, Jesus says, all right, if Moses is bearing witness on your behalf against me in this law court, let's bring him forward and see what he really says. And he says, what he really says is that he testifies on my behalf. So we read, do not think that I will accuse you before the Father. Your accuser is Moses, on whom you have set your hope. If you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote about me. But if you do not believe what he wrote, how will you believe what I say? We also have, on 3 occasions, the Feast of Passover. And particularly in John chapter 6, this Passover is interpreted, and Jesus interprets it with respect to himself. It begins with a reference that Jesus feeds the 5,000 about the time of Passover, and so there's our indication that Passover is the backdrop festival for what's to follow in John chapter 6. And Jesus then interprets the Passover rightly with respect to what happened to the Israelites in the wilderness. They ate manna from heaven. But then Jesus interprets this with respect to himself. He is the bread from heaven. And just as he has fed the multitude in the miraculous feeding of the 5,000, now the greater implication of that is Jesus is himself the bread that will feed the multitude. And as we read on in chapter 6, this becomes more and more concrete, to the point that people turn away from him. They're offended by what he says. That is, that they have to eat his flesh and drink his blood. His flesh is given for the life of the world, we read in verse 51. And he says, "Very truly I tell you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you." John 6:53. And that reminds us of what John the Baptist said, that Jesus is the Lamb of God who will take away the sins of the world. And it reminds us when we come to chapter 19, at another Passover, when Jesus is put to death, he is put to death on the day of preparation when the lambs are slain. Right about the time the lambs are slain, he himself dies on the cross. John 19:14-16. Another festival that's important for interpreting John's Gospel is the Feast of Tabernacles. And it is mentioned in John chapter 7, verse 2, the Feast of Tabernacles or Booths. John chapter 7 and John chapter 8 are a single event in the life and ministry of Jesus at the time of the Feast of Tabernacles. What has confused people sometimes in the past is if they read the woman caught in adultery story as part of the original text of John's Gospel, and that kind of breaks it up, and you're not sure what to do with 8:12 and following. But if you take that passage out that was stuck in there by some later copyists, and you just read straight John chapter 7 and 8, you see that it is a single festival that's in view. Now, this festival is associated with drawing water at the pool of Siloam. And remember, in John chapter 9, Jesus heals a blind man and sends him down to this pool of Siloam. For a long time, people were shown a pool that was called Siloam on the south side of Jerusalem. Still within Jerusalem, but right on the south side. Now, the picture here is of a pool that was excavated as recently as 2005. And a number of archaeologists think that this is actually the real pool of Siloam. It's a much larger pool than the one that was traditionally shown. And also, it is very close to the other pool. Now, George Beasley Murray, in his commentary on John's Gospel, says the following about this particular festival, the Festival of Tabernacles, or Booths. At the break of day, priests processed from the temple to the pool of Siloam. There they filled a golden pitcher with water and bore it back to the temple. On approaching the water gate on the south side of the inner court, the shofar, or trumpet, was sounded 3 times, joyous blasts which were explicitly related to Isaiah chapter 12, verse 3. With joy you will draw water from the wells of salvation. The priests, bearing the water, then processed around the altar, watched by the pilgrims, while the temple choir sang the Hallel, That is Psalms 113 to 118. Those psalms, by the way, were also sung at the time of Passover. When the opening words of Psalm 118 were reached, saying, "Give thanks to the Lord," every man and boy shook the lulab, which was a bunch of willow and myrtle tied with palm, shook the lulab with his right hand and held aloft citrus fruit in his left hand, which was a sign of the harvest gathered in. And the cry, "Give thanks to the Lord," was repeated 3 times. The same thing happened at the cry, "O Lord, save us," which comes in Psalm 118, verse 25. Since all this took place at the time of the daily offering, the water was offered to God in connection with the daily drink offering of wine. A chosen priest mounted the altar on which stood 2 silver bowls, one for the reception of the drink offering and the other for the water. When the priest had poured the wine and the water into their respective bowls, they were then poured out as offerings to God. The crowd then called out, "Lift up your hand!" The demand was made as a sign that the rite was properly fulfilled, since the Sadducees, that priestly group in Jerusalem, objected to the rite on the ground that it was not prescribed in the law of Moses. Accordingly, the priest had to raise his hand aloft to show that he had faithfully discharged his duty. Now, with that backdrop, let's read John 7:37 through 39, which is here on the slide. Remember, they go down to the pool of Siloam and bring water up, and then there's this drink offering. On the last day of the festival, the great day, while Jesus was standing there, he cried out, "Let anyone who is thirsty come to me, and let the one who believes in me drink. As the scripture has said, out of the believer's heart shall flow rivers of living water." Now he said this about the Spirit which believers in him were to receive, for as yet there was no Spirit, because Jesus was not yet glorified. The passage just read from John chapter 7 has in verse 38 a quotation, it seems, from the Old Testament. Out of the believer's heart shall flow rivers of living water. And yet, when you look into the Old Testament, you can't find any passage that has those words exactly. What often happens in Jewish interpretation is different texts are brought together to create an interpretation of the texts rather than a quotation of a singular text. And probably what's behind this is something like Zechariah 14 verses 8 through 9, a passage that might actually have figured during this festival as well. It reads, "On that day living waters shall flow out from Jerusalem, half of them to the eastern sea, and half of them to the western sea. It shall continue in summer as in winter, and the Lord will become king over all the earth. On that day the Lord will be one, and his name one." The same idea, also using water imagery, coming from the temple, is to be found in Ezekiel 47. So, for example, verse 1 reads, "Then he brought me back to the entrance of the temple. There water was flowing from below the threshold of the temple toward the east," for the temple faced east, "and the water was flowing down from below the south end of the threshold of the temple, south of the altar." Later on, verse 9a says, "Wherever the river flows, every living creature that swarms will live." So we have this vision of water flowing from the temple, flowing from Jerusalem, flowing from the altar, that brings life to all that it touches. Now, Jesus seems to be associating this water with himself and then also with the believer's heart, out of which will flow the river of living water. So it's a very rich imagery And what is practiced at the temple festival, the festival of Tabernacles, is now being associated with Jesus, with his followers who receive the water that he is bringing. Remember various water passages earlier in John's Gospel, such as in chapter 4, at Jacob's well with the Samaritan woman. And then also eschatologically, that is, as Jews look toward the end times and what God would establish in the age to come. So now what Jesus is saying is, this age has arrived. What the festival pointed to is now here, because I am here giving you living water to flow from your heart. As we continue on to look at this festival, we move into John chapter 8, verse 12. Again Jesus spoke to them, saying, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Also, we've just looked at Zechariah 14. A passage read at the Feast of Tabernacles is Zechariah 14, verses 5 through 9. Then the Lord my God will come, and all the holy ones with him. On that day there shall not be either cold or frost, and there shall be continuous day. It is known to the Lord. Not day and not night, for the evening time there shall be light. On that day, and here we get our living waters passage, shall flow, living waters shall flow from Jerusalem, half of them to the eastern sea, and so forth. Now, as George Beasley Murray continues to point out about this festival of Sukkoth, according to the Mishnah that tells us about this festival from the 2nd century A.D., in the tractate Sukkoth 5, we read that 4 large lamps during the festival were lit in the court of women. At the end of the first day of the feast, and from other sources on the other days as well, people went down into the court of the women. Golden lamps were there, and 4 golden bowls were on each of them, and 4 ladders were by each. 4 young men from the priestly group of youths had jugs of oil in their hands containing about 120 logs, and poured oil from them into the individual bowls. Wicks were made from the discarded trousers of the priests and from their girdles. There was no court in Jerusalem that was not bright from the light of the place of drawing water. Men of piety and known for their good works danced before them, that is, before the crowd, with torches in their hands, and sang before them songs and praises. And the Levites stood with zithers and harps and cymbals and trumpets and other musical instruments without number on the 15 steps, which led down from the court of the Israelites into the court of the women, and which corresponded to the 15 songs of the steps in the Psalms. So here again we have not only the imagery of water, but the imagery of light at the festival, and Jesus interpreting, or shall we say reinterpreting, each of those with respect to himself. Another festival is a festival that's not to be found in the Old Testament, because it has to do with the rededication of the temple in the 2nd century BC. Remember how Antiochus IV Epiphanes, the ruler of Syria, the Seleucid king, desecrates the temple in 168 BC. And then the temple is rededicated in 164 BC as the Maccabees push back against the Syrians. And in Josephus' book, Antiquities of the Jews, chapter 12, we read, And when the king, Antiochus the fourth Epiphanes, had built an idol altar upon God's altar, he slew swine upon it, and so offered a sacrifice neither according to the law nor the Jewish religious worship in that country. He also compelled them to forsake the worship which they paid their own God, and to adore those whom he took to be gods, and made them build temples, and raise idol altars in every city and village, and offer swine upon them every day. This is the desolating sacrilege referred to several times in the book of Daniel. And so the rededication of the temple is such a great event in the life of Israel that it becomes a yearly festival, the festival of Hanukkah. Now, John chapter 10, verse 22 says, "At that time the festival of the dedication took place in Jerusalem, and it was winter." And we know that this festival takes place just before our Christmas time in December. So John chapter 10 has as the backdrop the festival of Hanukkah. The connections with the Feast of Hanukkah and what we read in John 10:22 through 39 are not as clear as what we saw in John 7 through 8. And yet perhaps we can say some things about the relationship between Hanukkah and the words of Jesus here. First of all, since this is a festival that reminds us of the story of Antiochus the fourth Epiphanes and the need for someone to come fight on Israel's behalf against this invading non-Jewish pagan leader, Antiochus the fourth Epiphanes, the idea of messiahship may well be in focus here. John 10, verse 24, the Jews gathered around him and said, "How long are you going to keep us in suspense? If you're the Messiah, tell us plainly." And so is Jesus going to be the one to bring them a resolution to this invading force that occupies God's land and controls God's people? No longer the Syrians and Antiochus the fourth Epiphanes, but now the Romans. And then secondly, Jesus identifies himself with God. It's as if here at a festival that reminds Israel of a time when someone was called Epiphanes, someone who identified himself with God, was this invading foreign ruler that had to be overthrown or at least pushed back by the Jewish Maccabees. Now Jesus seems to create a new problem over identifying himself with God. And Jesus says in verses 30 and 31, "The Father and I are one." And so the Jews take up stones again to stone him for his blasphemy, his apparent blasphemy. And then thirdly, this is a festival to commemorate the Maccabean heroes who did manage to push Antiochus the fourth Epiphanes back and rededicate the temple just 3 years after the desolation of sacrilege took place. And so here these Maccabean heroes' good works are being commemorated, and Jesus speaks of his good works. He says in John 10:32, "I have shown you many good works from the Father. For which of these are you going to stone me?" And then fourthly, over against the Jewish national identity that is commemorated at the Feast of Hanukkah, Jesus speaks of the sheep that the Father has given to him. It's not anyone who is a Jew that is in view in Jesus' ministry, but those sheep that the Father has given him. Jesus draws a distinction between the Jews and those who are his disciples.